everyone, and welcome to today's edition of our 7investing podcast. I'm 7investing lead advisor, joined by my colleagues, my fellow lead advisors, Max Chatsko and Dana Abramovitz. Max, how are things in the great Northeast for you here today?
Pretty good, but we have like 2 or 3 more days of like summer weather, and then it just immediately drops off a cliff, and it's going to be in like the 40s at night, which I kind of like, but it's going to get colder, and that's depressing because we're not going to see great weather again until like April.
Prepare for the snow up there, my friend. It's coming for you. Dana, we don't have to have that problem in Houston, but I hope things find you pretty well here as well.
Yeah, no, it's actually nice, like it's now like a comfortable 85, 90 degrees. So, fall is here in Texas. It's great.
Fantastic. Well, we're pretty excited about today's podcast because we're going to be talking about a topic that doesn't necessarily get a whole lot of airtime, which is medical devices. We talk a lot about healthcare. We talk about drug development. We don't spend as much time focusing on medical devices. And we do want to give an overview of those today. Max, let me start with you on this because one of the key parts of a medical device is that it has protections. It has regulatory approval processes that provide it with protections over time that aren't so easy for competitors to replicate. But again, we're talking about medical devices here. We're not talking about drugs and pharmaceuticals. How are medical devices actually regulated? And how do we follow that as an investor?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the idea for this podcast kind of came from an internal discussion. There's a lot of nerdy details to consider too, and this does impact investors. So at a high level, there's a number of differences between medical devices and drug candidates and how they're developed and how they're regulated. So for medical devices, they're typically organized in 3 classes. There's class 1, class 2, and class 3 medical devices. A class 1 medical device is things like, a tweezer or like a bedpan or like gauze, things that, we have a pretty good assurance no one's going to get harmed in the making of, this medical procedure, right? So those can be cleared by the FDA through a relatively simple application process. That's called the 510(k) process. So it's important to point out too, the FDA clears those. That's not technically the same as FDA approval. A class 2 medical device is a little bit more, involved than a class 1. And usually a company will have to show that their new class 2 medical device is very similar to a previous device that's already on the market. So we call that a predicate device. And this can also use the 510(k) application process, meaning class 2 medical devices are also cleared, not FDA approved. And then a class 3 medical device is very serious. This is have the highest risks involved. So something like a ventilator, something that's going to be installed in a patient would be a class 3 medical device oftentimes. There's a risk of death or it supports a life of a patient. So the FDA wants a lot more data, a lot more scrutiny of how these are developed and used in patients. So these often require a clinical trial, kind of similar to how drug candidates go through clinical trials. However, it's important to point out that oftentimes a class 3 medical device might only require one clinical trial, single study. It doesn't have to go through phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3. So it does require a lengthier development process, but it's not like the 10-year development timeline that we see with drug candidates. Now, unlike class 1 and class 2 medical devices, a class 3 medical device has to go through a different regulatory framework, and that's called pre-market approval or PMA. It's a lot more rigorous than the 510(k) pathway. Again, it includes a clinical trial oftentimes. And so this does require FDA approval, not FDA clearance. So there you have it. Class 1, class 2, and class 3 gets a little more serious as you go down the line there.
Got it, Max. Okay, 3 different classes. Definitely good to keep an eye on as an investor. Dana, I know that you've worked in the healthcare industry for a couple of decades now. Anything you'd like to add about how medical devices are regulated or classified?
Well, I just want to remind everybody, and when we're looking at companies, and the things that they do, you're just like, oh, darn that FDA, but really they're in place to make sure that all of our drugs and medical devices are safe for everyone and effective. And so, part of that 510(k) process that Max mentioned yes, the device is cleared, but in order to pass that 510(k) process, the company needs to show that that device is safe and effective as that predicated that existing device that's already on the market. So it's not being a cleared device. It makes the process a little bit easier, a little bit less expensive to get to market, which is great for the company and for investors. But it's not, it's not like, the FDA is just like, oh, sure, go ahead. The company still needs to show that the device is safe and effective.
Certainly makes sense. For any medical implant that's in your body, you want to make sure that it's safe and effective. I am glad the FDA is so serious about how it regulates all of this. Max, one thing that's interesting, though, is that we've actually seen a rise in genetic testing in the last couple of years. We've seen Illumina bring Grail back in-house. Its Gallery genetic test is actually regulated differently than a lot of the other things that are going on in genomics and the drugs being developed are. Why is it that genetic tests are actually classified and regulated as medical devices?
Yeah, this is interesting. This is something that investors might overlook, but genetic tests are technically regulated as medical devices. So I'm not sure that was the intention when they set up these regulations. I'm not sure regulators saw how prolific and how much how these tools would take off, right? And they've kind of been caught flat-footed more recently. They're kind of always debating like, well, should we maybe increase our scrutiny of these tests, make it a little more difficult to bring these to market? Because increasingly, genetic tests are informing health decisions. For now, we don't have any real clarification of that. But yeah, there's 3 different designations for genetic tests. The first is research use only, RUO, and these cannot be used as a diagnostic. As far as I can tell, they don't require any regulatory application process because it's not technically a medical device. These are typically just used in-house by a company. It's usually the first step to bringing the next 2 categories either to the market or some part of their laboratory. The second designation would be laboratory developed test, an LDT. So this does require that 510(k) application. So again, it requires clearance, but not necessarily approval. And these types of tests are typically used for a centralized model. So the same, we call it a CLIA lab, and Dana knows a lot more about that than I do. She can maybe expand on that. But for a laboratory developed test, it has to be developed and manufactured and processed all within the same single laboratory. So that's one way to kind of help regulate these types of tests and tools. And then the third category is called an in vitro diagnostic, an IVD. This requires either a 510(k) or oftentimes a pre-market approval, PMA. So again, this is kind of like the equivalent of a class 3 medical device, right? And this works best for a distributed model. So rather than being bottled up and having to be self-contained within the same CLIA lab, an IVD can actually be distributed. So we can send this out to doctors or oncologists or medical centers, and they can be used at the point of care, maybe even processed at like a regional hospital or cancer center. So for example, a lot of liquid biopsies are actually regulated as an in vitro diagnostic, whereas maybe like a general germline screening genetic test might not be. It might only be a laboratory developed test.
Go ahead, Dana. Max said that you're pretty familiar with CLIA labs. I know you know a thing or two about those. Anything to add here?
I do. Well, so, it's interesting. So CLIA stands for Clinical Laboratory Improvement Act. And I think that came about in 1988, not, if we necessarily need the history. But, if you think about, the whole point of, the FDA and CMS, which actually regulates CLIA labs, is making sure that everything is safe and effective. And, within a lab, so in a CLIA lab, a lab has to go through, all of the same level of scrutiny that, a diagnostic or a drug would go through, right? So it's the same level of care. It's just that it's focused on the lab. So making sure, the lab has, certain standing operating procedures, that everybody is certified. They are reviewed, I think every 6 months or so, or maybe it's yearly. But yeah, so there is a lot of regulation that goes in to make sure that all of the processes that take place within that CLIA lab are standard and are consistent. So again, to focus on the safety and efficacy. So if you have a laboratory developed test, if you're doing a diagnostic and you're running a test in this CLIA lab, you want to make sure that the results are going to be consistent, because the results that you would give to a physician who would then give to a patient, need to be consistent and accurate and safe. But then if you think, if you're doing a distributed test, right, so an in vitro diagnostic, and you're selling that diagnostic to a doctor's office or to a hospital, and they have to do that themselves, then the FDA would want to make sure that that standalone thing can be carried out in a lab that may not be necessarily CLIA certified. And so, it's, again, if you think about, that same level of safety and efficacy, with that being the goal, it's just two different means to a similar end.
That's a great way to put it. So that's like ensuring that the results are reproducible, and it's a form of quality control. It just depends on where that box gets drawn, right? Around what? Around the lab or around the actual diagnostic. That's a great way to describe it.
Thanks. And, and it's interesting too, from a company, they may have different, views, because one way may be easier or harder, more challenging if you, went through the PMA process versus the CLIA certification. If you already have a lab set up that's already CLIA certified, it might be easier to do a laboratory developed test versus, creating something that you're going to be distributed. So it really then becomes the business decision of the company, how much time and money that they want to put into it. So again, something else that we can look for as investors.
Well, something else I wanted to take a look at as investors was a couple examples of what we're talking about. What are some publicly traded companies that are regulated as medical devices? Dana, let me start with you on this, because we were just talking about genetic tests. One company that does that is Invitae, ticker on that NVTA, of course, regulated as a medical device, does have CLIA certification. I assume that it's very important for this company to have that precision to minimize false positives and false negatives for some pretty serious things that it's looking for. What can you tell us about Invitae? What does this company do, and why is it important for it to have these regulatory clearances?
Yeah, so Invitae, it does a lot of the genetic testing. So they'll, and they do it through genome sequencing. So they're, looking for various mutations in a person's DNA that, may lead to a mutation. To a disease. So just, like it's a diagnostic, and, helping people understand, what may be wrong with them. And, often, with certain diseases, having to look at, your genome, helps identify, what might be wrong with you, and then a journey that may be uncertain. So they have everything in all of their CLIA labs, just to kind of do all that sequencing, and then also the interpretation, and what does a particular variation in someone's genome actually mean, especially now that we have all sorts of information about all the different genes and their affiliation with a certain disease, being able to kind of figure out what that is.
Max, anything you wanted to add to this? You pointed out that they were originally designated as research use only and laboratory developed tests, specifically for the liquid biopsies that they're working with, but they're actually looking for becoming in vitro diagnostics. Anything to add to what Dana just said about Invitae?
No, I mean, I think she nailed it. So just with that, they made the acquisition last summer, 2020, of Archer DX, and that enabled them to develop, and they actually acquired a few different liquid biopsy tools. So they can use those for maybe companion diagnostics or treatment selection, minimal residual disease, various other applications that liquid biopsies might be used for. Those have still not been approved by the FDA, but by bringing those in-house for Invitae, which already owns CLIA labs, they can actually generate some data and use them as laboratory developed tests initially, that might actually speed up some of the approval processing. So they'll have a more complete and robust data package to eventually send to the FDA. But eventually, like the largest market would be as an in vitro diagnostic, sending that outside of that centralized facility, closer to the point of care, maybe in those community settings as well, where I think 80% of cancer patients are actually treated. So, and Dana mentioned, kind of a business decision for, which route do you pursue? And you also have to keep in mind that you need to collect the samples too, so if you're shipping everything to one facility, that creates some unique challenges as well. So sometimes it might be better to do the in vitro diagnostic, but again, that's a hurdle, a regulatory hurdle, more money, more time. So all things to kind of consider there.
Great point, Max. Let's shift gears a little bit. We're looking for very small fragments of DNA floating around in the bloodstream when we're talking about liquid biopsies. Let's look at a much larger scale than that, though. Another company is called Nanox, N-N-O-X, which is involved with imaging. We know that X-rays are a big deal out there, and you're always wanting to get better information for doctors. What does Nanox do, and why are they classified as medical devices?
So I never pronounce things correctly, as Dana knows, but I always thought it was Nano X imaging, because I think there's
I've always said that, and now I've self-corrected myself.
Well, there you go. All right, so we'll say I'm wrong, but Nano X imaging. So they're making they're reimagining what an X-ray machine might look like, right? These are big, bulky machines. They're very expensive to purchase. Hospitals and medical centers actually pay them off pretty quickly, but then they still charge patients exorbitant prices for medical imaging, and NanoX says, no, we need to do better. So they've kind of scaled down a lot of the tools, the sources of the X-rays, and they've added some unique software and AI capabilities to actually interpret the images better. Hopefully, that's the idea anyway. So they can scale down a lot of the components of the machine, and maybe have these be implemented in more of a community setting. You don't need to go to a hospital, or it could also be cheaper for patients and centers as well. So NanoX has a couple of different devices in the works that it needs to get FDA clearance for. It has self-identified or self-classified all of its devices as Class 2 medical devices. The first was the single source NanoX ARC device, it's called. They had some back and forth with the FDA in terms of the FDA wanted more data, meaning the FDA wasn't sure that NanoX actually proved its new device was similar enough to the predicate device, meaning like a standard X-ray machine, and it was for a specific application. We won't get too far into the weeds. Eventually, after some back and forth, the FDA did provide clearance. Very important not to get tripped up there. So they cleared that 510K application. That's actually not the device that the company wants to make its flagship device for commercial operations. I think it's actually going to out-license the single source machine. It has a multi-source machine. That's the bread and butter here. That's what it wants to get rolling with. It just submitted the 510K application to the FDA. And again, the FDA came back and said, no, we need more data. What are you guys doing? A little more harsher in the tone as well. So, NanoX has to go back, collect more data, resubmit the data to maybe appease regulators. One thing that's important to point out as well is, sometimes if the FDA is not happy, or it just feels like you're wasting its time, or you haven't proven that your device is similar to a predicate device, it could actually bump you up from a Class 2 to a Class 3. So that would be like the worst case scenario, because it would greatly extend the development timeline. NanoX might have to run a clinical trial. That could take years, a lot of money. It would definitely, throw a wrench into manufacturing and scale up plans as well. So investors want to be careful to that the FDA doesn't bump that up to a Class 3 medical device. And NanoX also needs to get approval from the FDA or clearance for the software it uses within its devices. So it has a regulatory application it needs to file. It hasn't filed yet for the nanox.cloud. So that would be its software platform. And that's really the bread and butter for its business model as well. The company built itself as a medical screening as a service, an MSaaS company, kind of a new term there. But it wants to generate subscription revenue, basically on like a per scan basis for its machines. And the software is really at the core of that. And it has yet to file that with regulators so far, but that's something else that also needs to get cleared. So investors can watch for those things.
Okay, Dana, that sounds pretty risky to me. A lot of the things that Max just said sound like they might be red flags, right? Not only is the FDA requesting a comment for its multi-source Nanox ARC system, like Max described, but also that whole medical screening as a service. You're not making the money up front from the equipment. You're making money as this gains adoption. Anything you wanted to add about Nanox/NanoX, depending on what part of the country you're from?
Yeah, no, just yeah, no, definitely red flags. And just as Max was talking, I was thinking, like we often talk about when we're describing a company and the risks that they have, just regulations being a thing. And so anytime you're up against the FDA, remembering the FDA is there to make sure that we are kept safe and the drug and the device is effective. Just you are at their will, and just if they think that you need more information, you need to provide that information. And so that just it just really is a level of risk, just because it's not necessarily something that the company can control. They can certainly account for it, and do all the clinical trials and the data, and make sure that their application is submitted correctly. But it just does provide an extra level of risk when you're investing in any of the companies that are creating devices or drugs that are regulated by the FDA.
Great point, Dana. And just to throw one more publicly traded option for investors who might be interested in this space, we're going to throw one more in, which is STAR Surgical. Ticker on that is STAA. What STAR is producing is implantable Collamer lenses. So you can think of these as contacts that are permanently implanted into your eye right on top of your existing lens that you have. So it's an alternative to LASIK. LASIK is, using lasers to adjust the retina. This is an implantable lens that goes into your eye, permanently correcting your vision. This is an interesting one. It's a class 3 regulated device, as Max mentioned earlier, very serious. It's an implant into the body, into the eye itself. And it does have that pre-market approval that's required, Dana. This is an interesting one because it's really caught on in a lot of other countries outside of the United States first, before getting true adoption here in America. That's kind of an interesting one, right? We're always so used to seeing the drug developers or the medical device companies going to the US where the money is early. STAR has taken the opposite approach, gone after China, gone after Japan, gone after Eastern Europe, as it's kind of gotten the FDA on board with its manufacturing processes in California, first and foremost. But it is an interesting one. Collamer is a proprietary material. It's made out of a copolymer. It has collagen, actually, is one of the materials included as well. It's just kind of one of those that you don't hear about as much here in the States. Everyone thinks of LASIK, or you think of contacts, or you think of reading glasses. This one that's caught on internationally is now catching up with one of the world's largest markets. Max or Dana, any thoughts or anything to add about STAR Surgical?
I will say that, although a class 3 medical device requires that pre-market approval, and that might maybe be a turn off to investors because it's more difficult to obtain, it is also a barrier to entry. So we're not going to be dishing out these ICLs. What does that stand for? Can you say it again, Simon?
Implantable Collamer lens, Max.
Yeah,
Yep.
I was too busy squirming in my seat here, thinking about injecting something in my eyeball. But yeah, so we're not going to be dishing those out like candy. There's not going to be much competition, rather, for STAR Surgical. And same thing with liquid biopsies. I mean, at the end of the day, there's a lot of companies that are pursuing those, but there might only be like really a dozen or so companies that have approved liquid biopsies in a few years. Compare that to how many different drug developers there are. I mean, there's hundreds. So having those high level of scrutiny and regulations in place can provide a barrier to entry, and that's actually a boon for any companies that can clear that hurdle.
And I just wanted to add, there's, that business strategy of, going through, like the European Union, so getting a CE mark first, versus the FDA, just to kind of, test the waters a little bit. And, sometimes the different the different countries, their regulatory bodies may have different levels of, needs and qualifications. And so, again, a business strategy, like get your CE mark first, collect that data, in Europe, and then submit to the FDA or vice versa. And so, there's, it's interesting, just because, with this particular example, the consumers are much more interested in different parts of the world, and so helping to collect that data for other FDA approval before it takes on here in the U.S. So it's just kind of an interesting strategy.
Absolutely, Dana. Great point about different regions having different regulatory bodies, making this even more complex, but of course, barriers to entry for competitors that might want to compete against those companies. Great. So thanks very much, Max Chatsko. Thanks very much, Dana Abramovitz, for joining me as we talked about medical devices on today's podcast. Again, if you wanted to jot down those 3 companies we mentioned at the end, that was Invitae with the ticker NVTA, Nanox or NanoX, NNOX, and then last but not least was Star Surgical, STAA. Thanks very much for everyone for tuning in. We appreciate your time. We are here to empower you to invest in your future. We are 7investing.